Very happy to welcome today Laura Lynch, the host of What on Earth on the CBC, and she's been around the biz for quite a while. If you read her bio on the CBC website, and I'm very happy to have Laura with us today. And Laura, thank you very much for doing this, and we will throw it over to you.
Oh, thanks. Is that a way of just saying I'm really old, Trevor?
It wasn't intended.
Thank you all for joining us today. I really appreciate the time you're taking to think about this kind of reporting. I've been immersed in climate reporting now for 3 years after a long career of being a foreign correspondent and political reporter, national reporter, and started out, funnily enough, all those decades ago, covering the environment here in British Columbia. So in a way, it's been part of my journalistic career for a very, very long time. I've been primarily working in radio, but obviously, as all of us have branched out into other media as things have changed over the years. Just a little bit more about the show. It's called What on Earth? We created it 3 years ago. I had pitched it, and it just seemed that the time was right. There was an appetite for it, but only as a summer program. And only, and this was made very clear to us, if we focused on climate solutions. The argument being, which I accept, that people will not listen to a program that is about doom and gloom with no sense of whether there's any way that we can deal with or get out of this mess that we're in. So that became our focus: climate change solutions reporting. It began as a 9-part summer series, and I remember thinking about it with the producer at the beginning of how are we going to figure out how to do 9 episodes about climate change reporting? We can't possibly have that much material. Having stories to do in this day and age is absolutely no problem. We were then given an extension through to June of the following year, and then another extension to December, and then the atmospheric river happened, and we said, give us an hour. We were half an hour at that point. Give us an hour and we'll show you what we can do. And we are now an hour long, a podcast and a broadcast, and audience is tremendously interested, as we hear from them, loyal, growing, caring about what's going on. So it's to me been one of the most gratifying phases of my career, and it's been a challenge, which is something to say at this stage of things. And I think if I don't know where all of you are at, whether you are already doing climate reporting, whether it's something you're thinking about doing, but it is covering this story is both a blessing and a curse. There is so much to cover. It is the issue of the moment. It is the existential crisis of our time. But you just find that there's so little time to be able to cover all of the different areas that are out there for you to cover. I did want to say right off the top that we established from the very beginning with the backing of our editors that we would not engage in false balance when it comes to climate change. We do not engage with people who say climate change is not happening or that it's not man-made. We start from the premise that climate change is real, that climate change is human-caused, and we go from there. And I think that's an important first consideration for anyone to think about. So we don't engage with climate deniers on the program, and it gives us the ability to really focus on solutions and to focus in on stories that are sometimes catching out those who would deny that climate change is real or deny that fossil fuels are a part of the problem. The next thing to consider when you're looking at this is what kind of reporting is there to do with climate change? And I would say just about everything. But 2 of the terms that you'll probably learn fairly early on that will frame a lot of the stories that you do are mitigation, which is ways to try to obviously reduce emissions, which is the problem in this world. How to reduce emissions, whether it be sucking emissions out of the air, capturing carbon, whether it be saving carbon bogs, which are peat bogs, or forests, which can suck carbon in, whether it can be finding ways to build buildings that actually don't create more emissions then they can absorb all sorts of, and there's so many things going on in this area with hydrogen fuels, and there's different colors of hydrogen. I won't get into that. With different kinds of solutions that people are proposing that would get at this kind way of that we can approach trying to limit, cut back on, reduce emissions so that we can stay at or near 1.5 in the years to come. So that's a critical part of the story. The other part of it is adaptation. That is a real and growing aspect of this. Some of the changes that climate change is linked to are baked in. They're not going to change, or they're not going to change anytime soon. So the next thing that people need to do is learn how to adapt to it, learn how to be resilient, to deal with incredible numbers of forest fires, different kinds of fires than we're used to, fires that are much bigger, fires that start earlier in the season, fires that move much more quickly. How do you deal with that kind of thing? Storms like Fiona that take away people's homes on a huge, large-scale basis. What do you do about that? How do you adapt? Does that mean that you have to move? That's called managed retreat. That is also linked to climate change through the idea that oceans are rising, ocean levels are rising, and in parts of the world, it's not feasible to continue living on the coast anymore because the coast will be underwater. So there's lots more to say about both of those, but I'll just leave that with you for now. There's also different kinds of ways to approach all of this. And the first one, just a sec, I'll talk about is investigative. And that is obviously holding governments, holding corporations, holding people to account for their actions in contributing to climate change or in fighting against the effects of climate change. And I was on a panel with another journalist a few months ago who used to write for the New York Times, and his advice to the other people who were watching that day was follow the money. And I thought that was a really smart thing to say. He was starting from the premise that the new bill that was just passed passed successfully by the Biden government in the United States is handing out money for people to be involved in these kinds of projects of mitigation and adaptation. His point was follow the money that's going from government down into these communities and see where the money is going, because what you'll tend to find is money goes to people who really don't need it as much as those who are less able to take care of themselves. The people who don't need it as much know how to apply for the grants, know how to make them look attractive. Also, when I say follow the money, I say watch where federal and provincial dollars are going in terms of subsidizing loan guarantees, etc., to fossil fuel companies. We know that's been a long-standing issue in Canada, and government has yet to become truly transparent on how much money is actually tied up in fossil fuel corporations. We know there's a huge amount tied up in the pipeline that's going out to the West Coast that's supposed to be carrying bitumen. We own it. Taxpayers, we own it. And we still don't have a good idea of how much money is going into it, especially since no one else really seems that interested in buying it. I commend to you a story that was done by my colleague Lindsay Duncombe for the Fifth Estate this past year, an investigative piece on a UK company that was taking wood chips, waste, it argued, and turning that into a biofuel. Now, whether it's a biofuel that really makes sense in terms of the emissions it causes by burning the wood chips for fuel, set that aside and just look at what they said they were doing as opposed to what they were doing. They were actually owning cut blocks of timber in BC and cutting down the trees and not either denying that or glossing it over. What's more, the chief forester of BC, a government position next to the Minister of Forests, a civil service position, who had been advising government on this, left the government and went to work for this company in a matter of a couple of months. Tremendous investigative storytelling, holding people to account. There's also greenwashing, which is another investigative avenue, although some areas of that are a little easier. In that sense, I would recommend that you follow the Competition Bureau. They can send you alerts to what they're looking into. More and more complaints are being filed about greenwashing with the Competition Bureau, and it is seized of trying to say whether what these companies say they are doing is actually happening in terms of their attempts to bring down their emissions or net zero emissions. So that's a really good place to follow what's going on with this kind of advertising and greenwashing, which is happening a lot. Banks have already been slapped on the wrist about this. There's many more of these to come. That brings me to one of my favorite areas, which is, I know science and tech is the backbone of climate change reporting, but it feeds into so many areas. Taking them to court is happening more and more frequently. We're seeing it across the country and around the world, forcing their hand in terms of young people saying that their charter rights to life, liberty, and security of the person are being violated when their future is clouded by the effects of climate change. City governments talking about suing fossil fuel companies, saying that similar to the opioid lawsuits or the tobacco lawsuits, that the fossil fuel companies need to pay for the damage that they've caused to the environment. That's another thing you can follow right across the country, locally, nationally. Follow policy and government and what they're doing to hold them accountable for the kinds of actions they are or they aren't taking. So that kind of gives you an idea. I just going over to this page, I'm going to share all of this with everybody after the fact. There's a myriad amount of resources, places to go where you can learn about climate change, where you can find contacts, resources. I'll just mention a few. There's a number of newsletters that you can follow. First of all is ours at CBC. It's the What on Earth weekly newsletter. The Guardian has a newsletter called Down to Earth. The New York Times has a climate change newsletter, the Globe and Mail, and the Washington Post. Those are just a few. There are many, many others that you can follow. I commend to you, I haven't taken this myself, but I have a colleague who has. Reuters Institute of Politics offers a free online course through their Oxford Climate Journalism Network, and she raved about it and what she was able to learn through that. There's an organization called Covering Climate Now, which is for journalists who are covering climate, obviously. It has invited a number of organizations to work together, news organizations to work together in covering climate. It's well worth linking up to them and looking at the kind of coverage they're doing. I'm not going to go through all of these because there's just too much, but these are all well worth it. Just a couple more I think I'm going to include here. If you're looking for a scientist, and scientists are obviously a very important part of this, there are a few places you can look. Reuters, again, has a special report of a climate change scientist list, and this is global, and it gives you great information about who's out there and who's available to talk. Story Ideas and Communication, climatecentral.org. And then I'm just going to mention a few more without going to the websites. There are a number of Indigenous climate groups, and Indigenous First Nations are a critical part of this story in Canada, both for their knowledge and for what they disproportionately have suffered through climate injustice over the years. They are a wonderful group, all these different groups for you to go to learn more about how they fit into this story. One business-oriented site that I found really helpful is corporatenights.com. They are very focused on the business side of things, but with a really good, realistic idea of what's going on with climate change. And then I just have some others for law and NGOs that I will share with you as well. And you know what? That's really, honestly, that is just like the smallest part of how much is out there. This area is growing so fast as more and more people become seized of the issue and of the crisis. So I've given you kind of an overview of how you can report this story, of all the different myriad ways that you can follow it. So I just want to talk a little bit about the ways that you can have a better chance of ensuring that people actually read your stories. Because I saw a comment on our show on some website once, fairly early on, where someone said that they weren't going to listen to our show because why would you want to listen to that when you just because it's going to bring you down and there was nothing interesting in it for you that you didn't already know? Someone who had obviously thinks that the world is ending. So here's the news. The world is not ending. There's a lot that's being done, more than you could possibly know, and more than I know. There is lots being done to try to fight back against this, and things are changing. You can see that at a local level. You can see it on the international level, in covering the global gatherings every year. Those things are tedious and they're slow and they're frustrating, but you can see that the conversation is changing. And if you talk to people who have been involved in this game for a lot longer than I have, they can see that changing as well. And it's what gives them hope. So I'm going to go through this, but at the same time, I just want to remind you, if you can think about questions that you might have for me, I'm game to answer any of your questions. So just give a thought about that. And when I finish in about 10 minutes or so, we can switch over to you guys and see what you have to, what you want to know about. So covering the story. Some of this is basic journalism, but when you're covering climate change, and it can seem so big and it can seem so remote, less remote now with things like forest fires and storms, it's important to put a human face on the story, to not just say this report says this or this is happening here, but to make the effort to find the people who are being affected by whatever climate change related issue is going on. It will help make for much more compelling storytelling, and it always does. We all know this. It is storytelling, to ensure that people really can absorb what you're saying and can really say, well, yeah, that's another person who's going through this. I guess I can understand that as well, even if it's remote from their day-to-day lives. So we are always trying to do our best to put that human face, no matter what kind of a story it is. In a few weeks, and I'm not sure how this is going to go down, we're going to be featuring a longer interview I did with a young woman who got involved in climate change activism at quite a young age, fueled by her climate change anxiety, which is something we've talked a lot about on the show. And her anxiety was off the charts. She really struggled mentally with her anxiety, but it drove her to feel like she had to do something. And in this case, it was fighting the pipeline expansion. And she ended up going to jail for her activism and suffering a breakdown, and emerging from that with a new sort of take on how she can affect change and climate and find her own path and be resilient. It's a tremendously human story of what a lot of, not to say everyone who's struggling with climate change has that level of anxiety, but what a lot of people of a younger generation are facing. And I think she'll help really make people sit down and take notice of what the struggle is, of how some are coping with it, and how to find a way forward. And that sort of brings me back to this idea of hope and finding solutions. And when you think about solutions, don't think of it as being in a tiny box. Think really widely about what a solution could be. If it's a story about Newfoundland struggling to deal with the pandemic and climate change and the inability to feed itself because it has food security issues and the climate's not helping that, well, maybe the solution is finding ways for them to become more able to grow things at home. And there are things going on there that are allowing people to be able to feed themselves. And that's hope, and that's a solution. One of the other things I wanted to talk about was humor. You'd think that this is a dreadful Debbie Downer kind of subject that can never be funny. But it can. And there are people who are finding ways to make people listen or encourage people to listen by using humor. We had a comedian on the show a while ago who was talking about this very thing, right on the nose. His routine, he has done routines about climate change, and he's telling jokes. And it's not all black humor. Some of it is, and I love black humor, but it's just funny and it makes you laugh. And it's important to laugh at times like these, because you need to sort of let some of that go sometimes. So if you can find ways, funny ways to tell a story, or ways that celebrate people. We did a story earlier this year about a group of, wait for it, drag queens on ice. And this is in the United States. And they were doing shows to raise awareness about climate change. And they're a very funny, campy group. Naturally, that's what they were trying to do. But the kicker in their story was they had planned an outdoor skating event for raising awareness. And this was in Pennsylvania. But the weather became unseasonably warm and the ice melted too much. So they couldn't do the show because of the weather. So there you go. What irony that the very thing they're trying to raise awareness about stopped them from doing their performance. They were able to do it later on. But that is just an example of people telling stories that are funny, but also put a point across. So I would encourage you to look for that among the menu of stories that you might do. It's not obviously it's not always appropriate, but there's room for it in the conversation. So the last thing I think I want to talk about now, although I'm certainly open to talking about other things, is something that I've learned through the last 3 years of doing this, and that is to tap into human resilience in all of this. I have been consistently impressed by people's resilience and how they are able to cope and how much more they want to be able to do to make a difference when it comes to this subject. I've talked to farmers who have had their livelihoods decimated by climate change, whether it be the atmospheric river here in British Columbia that ruined so many farms, killed so many farm animals, drought, people just having trouble growing their crops to begin with, that constant stress that farmers already live with being exacerbated by everything that climate change is bringing to them. And I talked to a woman who is both a farmer and a trained psychotherapist. And in the midst of all this, she had created a specialized form of treatment for farmers. Because as she told me, farmers are sort of very stoic and they don't want to talk about maybe the fact that they're depressed or maybe even feeling suicidal. But she was able to bring the practice to them in such a way that they were finally open to being able to talk about that and getting real help. And now that program is going national. The one that she developed in Ontario has become national. And she's managed to get them more and more farmers coming in for treatment or turning to others for treatment, and even telling other farmers that they're doing this, which is a tremendous breakthrough for this group. So they're all trying and finding ways to deal with the tremendous stress that they are living through. And I commend that to you time and again, to look to where people's strengths are, to look to where they're finding support, how that support can be found, where it can be tapped into. We've started doing something a little bit, sometimes I will admit, a little bit cheesy on the show, but there is room for it, I think. And that is, we, from time to time, highlight what we're calling climate heroes or climate champions, people who are doing something on a very local level to help their communities. And it's tremendously encouraging to hear from people who are trying to make a difference in small ways, not giving up, because one of the things that we've learned throughout doing this, when we say, well, what can I do about climate change? I just don't think there's anything that can be done, or how can I make a difference? The one thing you hear time and time again is get involved, get out there, do something, even if it's something small in your neighborhood. Do something big if you want to, but talk about it. Talk to people and tell them about what's going on, learn about it. And that way you'll feel more empowered, more seized of what you can do about it, rather than thinking it's just something that can't be managed. And I would leave you with this hairdresser that I talked to down under in Australia, who runs a pretty high-end salon in Sydney, and she took it upon herself to learn about climate change. And then I'm not talking about reading a few articles. She went to the source. She went to climate scientists and really schooled herself in it. And then she started talking to her clients about it. And because she knew they listened and they had started taking action as well. So there's tons of great stories out there like that. And much more that I probably can't even think about right now. But I think I'm going to leave it there for the moment and see if anybody has any questions about it. Trevor, I'm not sure how we're going to handle this. I can't quite remember.
I will, what I'll be doing is I'm just going to monitor the chat, and I'm going to read out some questions as well. I have one to start off with. We do have a couple already, but just to give some people maybe a moment to write a question as well. So the one I'll ask is sort of going back to sort of what you said something sort of at the beginning about the two sides of the climate story, and how on your program you don't really do the two sides. And I was just sort of wondering, what was the conversation like with the editors, sort of when that happened? And just like, do you have any suggestions for writers or for journalists who are sort of pitching climate stories and sort of running up against this, running up against this in their own conversations?
Wow. It wasn't even really a conversation, Trevor. It was just an accepted fact. It was just like, and it's in our journalistic policy, I think now too, although I'm not 100% sure that this is happening. This is here. It's not up for debate anymore. So it's not something that we had to discuss. If there are journalists out there who are running up against it with their editors, it's certainly easy to find the kind of literature you need to get them to read, so that they can understand that this is not up for debate, that this is false balance. And I really have a hard time thinking that any smart journalist would think that there is anything to discuss anymore. Every day we're seeing it around us. I mean, we do get emails from climate deniers. Yes, we do. They get angry. But the vast majority know that this is the world that we're living in. I would say to any journalist, if they are having a problem, and I wanted to say this anyway, that I'm also a resource for anyone who would be running up against that, or who has a question that they want to talk to me about another time. I'm more than happy to talk to anybody about this, because it's such an important topic. But boy, I would be so surprised if there's a smart editor out there who's saying, "Oh no, you have to get the other side." The other side is the fossil fuel companies, I should say.
Yeah.
The other side is government, depending on what story you're doing, and you do your normal journalistic practice within that, and we do that all the time. We give them a chance to respond. We invite them on the show. We were supposed to have someone on from the Pathways Alliance, which is this group of companies in Alberta who are working in the oil sands and the bitumen, trying to say they're getting to net zero, even though the technology is not yet proven at scale, and even though they're asking government to pay for it instead of them. They agreed to come on, and then they suddenly dropped us and said no. And I'm not sure why. I'm known as a fairly tough interviewer. Maybe that was the case. I'm not sure, but they did end up being on the House that same week. So we're doing our best. We're trying to get those perspectives out there. Challenge. There's all sorts of room for challenge and accountability, and I'm all for that. So if you're talking about that side, when I was talking about false balance, I was talking about those who deny it outright.
Gotcha. Great. So one from the group now. Do you cover the carbon tax? How and why?
We have covered it in the past. We covered it by trying to talk about what it is in the terms of political interviews, what it is, what it's meant to accomplish, whether it's been successful. There's debate about whether the carbon tax actually has managed to do what government said it will do. There are two sides on that story as well. So I believe, I'm reaching back into my memory here, it was in the context of an interview with either the minister or with he has a council advising him of environmentalists and business types about whether it's working. And I don't think there is a federal climate and environment auditor who I think had some complaints about the way the tax was or wasn't working, and we may have covered that as well. Typically, those kinds of stories would also be covered in news, and because we're a current affairs program, we take a much bigger and broader view. I'm not sure if that helps answer the question, but those are areas to look for in it.
Okay, if you did ask a question, by the way, we will get to it. So we have about 3 more left. We'll do this next one, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit. So we know that dealing with the climate crisis involves thinking about and implementing system change, from everything, producing electricity to growing food. But that type of discussion about system level change can be difficult. How do you address that as a journalist?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Because that's when you start to get away from things like that I was talking about, like putting the human face on stories, but still critically important to talk about. Systemic change, obviously, we're talking about at the political level, at the international talks level. We do talk about that, and we have talked about that in terms of things like government's agreements to try to provide monies from developed to less developed countries to help them deal with climate change, to try to mitigate their emissions in their own countries and to adapt, because of the obvious situation that the countries that have contributed the least to climate change are the ones who are dealing with the worst effects of that. That also goes for Northern Canada. So systemic change on that level is something that we don't shy away from. We will talk to the people in those less developed countries or parts of Canada that are suffering more through it. That's another way to actually put a human face on it, while trying to hold government to account for how much or how little is being done to help these nations. I've got to just tell you, we in our show each week, we do a little capsule of climate news, and there was a tremendous story that came out last week from Reuters, and a group of students at Stanford, and they followed the money. They looked at this fund that had been created by developed countries to try to help these less developed countries deal with climate change. Guess what? They found that monies that had been distributed so far, among other things, from Italy, had helped countries in Asia set up chocolate and gelato shops. And gee, that doesn't really seem to be about climate adaptation or mitigation. Japan had sent funds that were helping to build a coal plant in Bangladesh, one of the countries hit most by climate change. You tell me how a coal plant helps deal with or fight against climate change. Japan also gave money to Egypt to help expand an airport and build a runway. Tremendous reporting that holds governments to account in ways that people can look at and just have that visceral reaction. From their reporting, from what I read in their reporting, they said Canada is actually walking the walk, that the money that Canada is giving is going toward these projects. But the larger part of this is the fact that this pot of money has no regulation to it. There's nobody overseeing it, which is a real problem. Mm-hmm. It's just, trust me, I'm going to give you the money, and trust me, it's going to go to the right thing. So that points up another weakness of all of this. So that's one way to look at these kinds of difficult, large-scale efforts that are being done internationally. The other ways of just doing it is trying to make governments accountable for the policies that they're implementing. And in educating the public about that, the policy changes come, as we know, from us, from voters, choosing who is doing what they believe is needed to contend with the climate crisis. I hope that helps answer the question.
Okay, well, the next one is from a new journalist living in the Atlantic provinces, and they're looking for what are some of the most important tips you can give to sort of get started, I guess, to get sort of the information needed to sort of start it on the. And I know we're going to share a lot of links and a lot of information afterwards, but is there anything particular about the Atlantic province? I mean, right now there are several fires going on there, but I mean, is there anything in particular that you have off the top of your head?
Well, what I'd say is if you're wanting to know what's going on in your own backyard, it's go to, and I didn't put this in the links, but there's so many NGOs that are getting involved in climate change. So go to some of the obvious ones like Greenpeace or like the David Suzuki Foundation and poke around or ask what groups there are that are in Atlantic Canada or are focused on Atlantic Canada or branches of it that are focused on Atlantic Canada. And you'll start digging down into that. And I promise you, there will be lots. There'll be citizen organizations, there'll be NGOs, Indigenous organizations. And then you can probably start to find other journalists in the region. I know of some who are covering climate change there as well. And before you know it, you will think, how can I actually deal with all of this? Because there is so much. If you're having trouble, as I said before, you can ask me about it. I may be able to hook you up with a few people in Atlantic Canada who are already doing this, because I don't know of a purely Atlantic Canadian organization off the top of my head. I will tell you one really cool story we did within the last year about Summerside, which has got an enormous solar panel farm set up there. That is really doing some amazing things. And the part that we focused on for the purposes of our show was the fact that they banked all the energy they collected on their solar panels and used it to power a Bryan Adams concert. And they were sweating, not because it was hot, they were sweating because they wanted to make sure the power stayed on. And he didn't know about it when he was doing the concert, but it did. They managed to power the whole concert with solar energy. So small story, but really reinforcing that solar can be a really good and somewhat stable source of energy in the world.
Well, that's I found that a great story. Sorry, I just had to say so. So we have one more question, but before we get there, I just want to say thanks again, everyone, for attending, and thank you, Laura, for giving this. I mean, I learned a lot, and I will click through all the resources that you sent, and that we will send around again as well for anybody who came late. But if you do want to see more sessions like this, they are available on the RTDNA's website. This is the fourth in this series, and we had some really great ones. So please head over to the site and explore. And we will get to the last question now. And it's something we sort of touched on, but maybe Laura, you could summarize in a quick couple sentences, and we can end it there. How do you balance stressing the gloomy climate crisis and giving readers a hope?
Right. Yeah. And I obviously think about this a lot because you have to, you need to be upfront with people and frank and honest with people. I mean, it's what we do as journalists, and you need to scrutinize all kinds of ideas and proposals, business plans, etc. But that doesn't mean that there aren't ways to show, as I was saying before, that there just is so much going on out there. And you'll hear this from others who have been involved in this issue for years, that while things are not great and the world is heating up and we haven't seen enough of a significant cut in emissions, there's never been a time when people have talked about this issue more, understood this issue more, and are doing things about it more on all fronts. Scientifically, politically, in the business world, climate activism. It is really starting to break through. It's more than starting to break through. It has broken through. It's pierced the consciousness of just about everyone, which is probably one reason why you're here today. And that in and of itself is hope. That says that things are happening, and people are seized of this and are wanting to see change and are working toward it.
What a great way to end it. Well, thank you again so much, Laura, and thank you, everybody. We will see you next time, and have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.